Hello, welcome to the Walrus Talks at Home, CanCon Online, presented by Facebook Canada. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus, and we're thrilled to be joining you online this evening, connecting people across the country and beyond in conversation. Also, happy Media Literacy Week. This is an annual event promoting digital and media literacy across Canada all week long. We'll start by acknowledging the land that we're on, and this is part of our larger conversation today on Canadian content and storytelling, because the land is not neutral. There's a history and colonization, and a land acknowledgement helps us recognize where the story starts, what's happened in the past, thinking about how it informs where we are now and what changes can be made as we move forward in a commitment to reconciliation. I'm in downtown Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Toronto. This is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And the Walrus, we're really honored to carry on a long tradition of storytelling and encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, wherever you're joining us from tonight. And as part of a commitment to reconciliation, we encourage you to read the 94 calls to action recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Walrus is committed to being a platform for Canada's conversation, challenging, urgent, complex, and thoughtful conversations with a range of voices. And we do this in a number of different ways through our journalism in print, but also online at TheWrit.ca, through our podcasts, The Conversation Piece, and through our event series, which includes the Walrus Talks. During the pandemic, the Walrus Talks at home, in my home, and your home. And this work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to Facebook Canada for making this conversation possible. Facebook Canada is our national partner on the future of the internet. And tonight's event is part of a year-long partnership that really expands the conversation on some of the biggest digital issues of our time. I'd now like to welcome Erin Taylor, who's the Communications Manager at Facebook Canada. Hi, Erin, how are you doing?
Classic, forgot to unmute.
Hey, we're live, it's all part of it. Over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you to all of you joining from home. I'm Erin Taylor, and I'm on the public policy team at Facebook Canada. Over the past year, we've been working with the team at the Walrus to expand public discussion about the future of the internet in Canada and its role in society. Together, we've covered a lot of ground, digging into topics that span the future of speech online, news and platforms. And at each talk, a star-studded panel of speakers leads us in a substantive discussion that takes a multidimensional view of the benefits and challenges of the internet. You can check out all our past talks and learn more about the partnership at walrus.ca/future of the internet. Today is the last talk in our series, and the conversation is focused on Canadian content and the creator economy. And we're thrilled to welcome Éric Grenier, Richard Lachman, Tara O'Brady, and Samantha Yammine to lead the discussion. Each brings a unique and in many cases lived experience for what it means to create Canadian content online and to pursue a living doing it. Their work dispels the misconception that creators simply share nice photos. In my role at Facebook, I work with a lot of people who leverage the internet to share stories, ideas, and perspectives that they feel are otherwise not reflected in broader national dialogue. They flock to online platforms like Facebook and Instagram, as well as Medium, Substack, Twitter, and TikTok, among many others, to share their perspectives without intermediaries. And more than finding a hungry community of followers, creators are making careers and livelihoods, forging a path forward towards a new frontier of entrepreneurship, ultimately carving out a new economy, which in August, Forbes estimated to be over $100 billion US. Since this new economy is rooted in digital platforms, it's perfectly poised for national and international export, unlocking new revenue streams and venues for celebrating made in Canada content. There are so many facets of the creator economy that we have yet to explore. In the lead up to today's discussion, Jen, Andrea, and I were talking, and it seemed like each idea we brought up sparked a new one. Like, what does this economy grow into in the future? What will it look like? What are the implications for the future of work? What can Canadians and regulators do to support continued innovation in this space? I can't wait to listen and hear how today's incredible speakers are shaping the future of this industry. And on that note, back to you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Erin. Tonight's conversation is going deeper on Canadian content online. And for me, I've had the pleasure of working in a range of Canadian content industries over the last 25 years, from media to music. And there was a time not too long ago when "That's So Canadian" was a diss. It meant that the TV show was lower quality than, say, Hollywood budgets, or the music, if you described it as Canadian, it was like a very specific alt rock sound. But today, our top culture exports are truly Canadian and international, be it Drake or Justin Bieber, Lily Singh, Schitt's Creek, poet Rupi Kaur. But our policies, like the Canadian Broadcasting Act, don't adequately reflect our current media and social media landscape, where TV is YouTube and radio is your phone. And audiences more and more are truly global. We also have a new economy driven by creators and digital audiences with a range of revenue sources for content creators. This includes advertising, paid subscriptions, sponsored content, to even moving to mainstream media, including TV and film. So I'm looking forward to hearing from tonight's talkers on this topic, and then delving deeper into the rising creator economy during the Q&A discussion. So here's how it works tonight. Each speaker has 5 minutes live, and then once your head is full of new ideas, we're going to have a moderated discussion with our talkers and you, our audience at home. So please feel free to submit a question at any point through the Zoom chat box or in the Facebook Live comments section. And we also, of course, encourage you to share this conversation on social media. You can just tag us at The Walrus on all the major platforms and use our hashtag Walrus Talks. Tonight, we'll be hearing from our talkers, Éric Grenier, author of TheWrit.ca, Dr. Richard Lachman, Director of Zone Learning and Associate Professor at X University, Tara O'Brady, food writer and cookbook author, and Dr. Samantha Yammine, Neuroscientist and Science Communicator. Thank you all for joining us, and we're gonna kick things off with Samantha Yammine. Welcome.
I'm Samantha Yammine. I'm a neuroscientist by training and a science creator across social media platforms. For reference, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok as @science.sam or Hey Science Sam to find me on Twitter and Facebook. I want to share with you today some of the things that I didn't really think about when I started off as a creator, and I hope that that can help frame a larger discussion for us about how we view and value creators. First, I want to say it's a pretty unconventional career path to go from doing a PhD, studying brain cells under a microscope, to being a content creator, but it's one I truly fell into. I started using Instagram about 5 years ago because I wanted to break down barriers to accessing science and bring it to where people already were, which of course was on social media. I'm the only scientist in my family and really in my close friend group, and I wanted them to see what I was working so hard doing in the lab and help them see all of the things that went into making something a scientific fact. At the time, there were some, but not many people with my specific background as a wet lab researcher using the platform in this way to be really a portal into the scientific process. So while I started it for fun, it ended up being really amazing to see what a cool gap I could fill and see how excited people got, what an impact I could have, particularly in dispelling myths in real time as they were proliferating on the platform. To put science in the exact same newsfeed where the myth and misinformation was really exciting. And now, as you can probably imagine, the appetite for this has only grown over the course of the pandemic. And while I originally, my content was very much about light, evergreen science, in January 2020, I started what was supposed to be a 1-week series about the new coronavirus. And I think we can all agree it's been the longest week ever. But the reason I haven't gone back to what I used to do is because there's still a huge need. There are still lots of people very interested, and to be able to connect with people in that way is really important. So while there's lots of criticisms to give to social media, and I'm sure we'll get into some of them, I cannot understate how rewarding it can be to be able to connect with people in this way, to build relationships with people you otherwise wouldn't ever be able to meet. In my case, to be a scientist for someone who otherwise doesn't know a living scientist directly. Being able to help thousands of people connect with evidence to get a life-saving vaccine during a pandemic, that's more than I'd ever hoped of being able to ask of my career. And that's really why I do what I do. But I think as we continue to demonstrate the impact of our work as creators, it's important we acknowledge the huge gaps in how it's valued. Contrary to popular belief, a blue check on social media does not mean you get paid by the platform to create content. While all the platforms are making incremental steps to try to move towards direct creator compensation, content creation is a full-time job, but it doesn't automatically pay like one. So we got to get creative again on how we get paid. For me, it's a lot of consulting work that just adds to my workload, and burnout is a real issue. So it puts a major constraint on what we can do and what we can create on the platform. And there's always this tension between, I got to put out content, but also I need to pay rent and all this stuff. The way some creators focus their work so they can get paid while prioritizing content creation is through brand partnerships, where you post about specific products and you get paid to do that. And when done well, they can be really great. And a lot of people are very successful doing that. But for a lot of us, definitely me as a scientist, many activists, for example, this doesn't really work out. There's a tension and there's a trust with our audience, and they don't want to see us doing certain partnerships. And so you're very, very limited. And that doesn't always work out. That's not something I've done a few, but not very many. And often in my niche, since it's a very unique kind of niche, I'm the first creator a brand has worked with, and there's just so much that goes into making that partnership happen. It's not entirely sustainable. And I'm not sure how sustainable it is for other creators. A common alternative to the relying on brand sponsorships is creating some exclusive content with via a creator community like Patreon. I think those can be great, but again, what about creators like me, where our mission is to make science accessible or to make some sort of educational thing accessible? Putting it behind a paywall doesn't really jive with that mission. And so that's not something I've been able to really tap into yet either. So we're left with merch, really, which I guess I hope to be able to do soon, but I don't know when, and also why. Why is having to create merch, which is like not at all what I'm an expert in, what I have to do to support what I love to do and what I know is valuable. So don't get me wrong, I know we have to figure out a business model that works if we want to be entrepreneurs, but creators have established demand and generated value, and we just don't have the ecosystem behind us that's keeping up. With every big event, like when activists step up and create huge grassroots movements, or literally we're in a pandemic and my peers and I have stepped up as science communicators, I keep thinking the tide will turn and we'll finally find a way to support what we do, but we haven't yet. And I think that's very telling. And it's definitely sent a kind of sad signal to me as a science communicator and a creator, that even in this time when I've been able to reach millions of people a month, connecting them with important information, I still haven't been able to get any kind of grant or any like sustainable support beyond all of my side hustles. So this is true also for many other creators in Canada, creating content in other spaces from arts and culture, food, entertainment, fashion. We've brought many forms of value through education, entertainment, whatever category. And my question is, what's next? How do we keep it up? I'm excited to chat with others in this space on solutions to figure out who can change things finally and how, so that Canadian creators that bring enormous value in unique and important ways can start to actually be valued. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Richard Lachman. I'm a professor at X University, and clearly content creation is a huge and growing industry over the last few years. When my students apply now to a media program, they're not sending a video they made in the high school AV club, they're sending their content channels, they're sending their subscriber counts, they're sending their marketing partnerships they've worked out. So given that growth, I want to talk about content creators in a way we don't normally think about it. Content creators as members of the gig economy. And that's not normally what we think about in the gig economy conversation. This is not an Uber driver or a Foodora delivery, where we tend to think of those as managed through our phones and turned into an almost mechanistic, non-human way where things just get done. content creators are, of course, highly visible. They're highly human. They're personality driven. But from a labor point of view, it's freelance work in the service of a large technology driven company. That life is at the whim of an algorithm. There's no job security. There's no benefits. And the streamer or the content creator is not an employee, even though the work they do is the company's primary driver of revenue. We're starting to hear individual streamers and creators talk about burnout. And that's sometimes invisible because when a content creator disappears, someone appears right behind them. It's an incredibly competitive landscape. But it is time for this industry to grow up. Digital businesses have been protected from the rules of law or even social practices because we want to nurture their growth. But it's time to think about how wider society is affected by these emerging digital businesses because they're not emerging anymore. They're huge. We need to think about sustainability, fairness. We need to think that the fact that something uses digital technology shouldn't protect it from the intention of our laws, even if our laws haven't exactly caught up. So I want to talk about some specific challenges in the content creator world. Chief among these is the 24/7 demands of an insatiable audience. If you have just completed an 8-hour game stream and you shut down, you have a satisfied portion of an audience, but someone else has just woken up and they are demanding, what have you done for them lately? It's an incredibly competitive landscape. There are lots of options for individual audience members and a lot of expectations for how much content they're going to make. There are no sick days. There's no parental leave. And so it means as a long-term career choice, there's some challenges in this. There's an opportunity cost. If you've chosen to become really good at content creation, what haven't you done? Did you drop out of school? Did you not pursue other skills developments? And as you age up, and maybe you're no longer 19 and your finger is no longer on the pulse of what's cool in this place, what's the job left for you? Athletes, if they move out of their prime productive period as an athlete, can become commentators, they can become coaches. What do streamers become? Another thing I want to touch on is the nature of the work environment. If you think about toxic work environments for other kinds of jobs, and then you look at the YouTube comment stream, that is a toxic environment and you are isolated, you're alone, and you're dealing with something that can be extremely challenging. And so the mental health components of your day-to-day work can be tremendously difficult. There's also high vertical integration. So when you are working in this, you are the marketing team, you are the technology team, you're the media maker, you're the editor, you're working on merchandising, everything as one person. And that may be really difficult to do. So until you get really big enough to have a team, you're doing everything yourself, the mistakes and the stress of making all of these negotiations to try and make a living. And maybe you got in to focus on the content, but you have to do everything. The last thing I want to touch on is things around the dealing with the platform. There's not a lot of transparency into terms of service, into the fairness of the cut. So different platforms have a very different business deal. If I think about Spotify, where if you're a musician, you get a share of all plays. So if you have a couple of plays versus millions or billions of plays, you get a very tiny amount of money versus a platform like SoundCloud, where if I'm a subscriber and all my views are of your content, you get the majority of my subscription. So what's happening and what needs to happen? We're starting to see fan and public pressure into changing some of the terms of service, transparency, and the ways the platforms operate. We're starting to see mental health be part of the conversation in content creation, just like it's happening in athletics and other parts of our society. We're starting to see professionalization. So there are now management services. There are now influencer marketing groups that will deal with the brand relationships. That's challenging because, as in the early days of music, you may go into a contract that you don't know a lot about and sign with a deal. So hopefully we won't see exploitation, but we're starting to see some professional services to help you. And the last thing we're starting to see is organized labor. There are talks of streamer movements. There've been boycotts on the part of collective groups of streamers. We're starting to see group and collective bargaining for shares of things. So I think as this happens, as this grows up, we're going to start to see some massive changes in who's going into content streaming, how they're thinking of this as a career choice, and what the platforms are doing in their relationships. Thanks a lot.
Hello, my name is Éric Grenier. I'm the writer at TheWrit.ca, and I've actually been in online content creation for quite a long time, and a lot longer than I even realized before it was a thing. I'd started as a freelance writer a long time ago, and I started a website, 308.com, back in 2008. And that was really just my way of writing about politics, writing about polls, things that I found interesting, but it wasn't really a way to make any money. Freelance writing is, of course, something that is a bit of a challenge. But after a few years of kind of plugging away at it, I was able to start writing regularly for the Globe and Mail and some other media outlets and make a little bit of a living, start a little bit of a career. And in 2014, I was able to get a job with the CBC as their polls analyst, a role that I had for 7 years. Now, this was a great opportunity. It was a real job with paid vacation, benefits, all these things that I didn't have when I was a freelancer. And I learned a lot, and I worked with some great colleagues. But I think, like a lot of people, the pandemic had me rethinking some of my what I wanted from my work-life balance, what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to get from both work, but also the time that was my own. So earlier this year in June, I decided to leave the CBC and go back to being an independent writer, starting TheWrit.ca. This is a website dedicated to elections in Canada, provincial, federal, by-elections, election history, polls, the kinds of stuff that I find most interesting, and really where I got started when I entered into this industry. Now, the platform that I use at TheWrit.ca is Substack. Substack is a bit of a newer platform in Canada in particular. This is a model that uses a subscription service, so you can subscribe to a newsletter like mine. And if you are a paid subscriber, you can get exclusive content. You can get access to all of the content. As a free subscriber, you can also get access to some content. And what happens with a platform like Substack is that when people sign up and someone like me writes something, it goes into a person's inbox. So it's a way for a writer to have a bit more of a reliable stream of income if you have subscribers that are willing to pay every month, pay every year, as if it is a magazine or a newspaper. And it's also a way to have a different kind of relationship with your audience. Because one of the things that I've noticed is the biggest change since my transition from the CBC is that when I was writing for the CBC, I was trying to reach the broadest audience possible, trying to make sure that I was reaching everybody that I could. But now it's more of a niche audience. I'm trying to write for a specific audience that wants specific content and is maybe just as much of a geek as I am when it comes to political history and elections in Canada. So it's a very different kind of platform to use. But as I've discovered now that I'm more into this world of content creation, is that you have to be everywhere. I was on Twitter before, I had a little bit of a following, but it's very important now in politics and journalism to be on a platform like Twitter, and you can use it to maintain that audience relationship, which I think is really important. For example, I use Twitter to reach out for asking for questions for my podcast, another medium that you have to be on. You have a different way to reach people, want to consume different kinds of content. It's a way to get some advertising, perhaps trying to diversify your income streams. It's also actually a good networking tool. You have somebody on your podcast and suddenly you have a good contact. Going into YouTube, trying to repurpose some of the content you have, another way to reach your audience, another way to have that, that direct relationship, having live streams. Maybe monetizing it. The thing is that you need to have all of these different platforms to reach your audience in as many different ways as possible and to have as many possible income streams, because in Canada, it is a little bit of a challenge. And this is one of the things that I'm interested in discussing is what is the content creation universe like if you're trying to actually produce content that is specifically for Canadians. It's one thing to be a Canadian producing content for everybody around the world, but if you're trying to create something that is for Canadians, can it be done? We're a small market, 38 million people. If you're writing in English, it's only 30 million people. So I think that this is one of the challenges here, especially in the world of journalism. Substack is something that is new to Canada in some ways. We've seen in the United States, there have been some pretty high profile journalists that have made a good living off of it, but can it be done in Canada? Is our market large enough? Is it a solution for local journalism? Can it be something that can help journalists make a living in a different way if they don't want to go through some of the major gatekeepers? So I think this is one of the biggest questions that I have when it comes to Canadian content creation from a writer, from a journalist perspective. And I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say tonight. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm food writer and cookbook author, Tara O'Brady. When I began to consistently write online in 2005, it was a food blog in the nascent days of the genre. I could not have predicted digital media would change my life. And I'd like to talk about how much the job of being a creator has changed as well. The promise of Web 1.0 was the democratization of information, egalitarian, largely divorced from the constraints of age, gender, or geography. The utopian belief emerged that one could be anyone online, and I thought the same for me. I had a writing background, so I would be a writer online until I could be a writer in my real life. To go with my words, I took photos with a tiny camera and a lamp I dragged from one side of the kitchen to the other. I wrote without thought to an audience. It was simply a message sent out into the ether with the hope that somehow it would echo back, rebounding off some like-minded individual. It was a hobby. Then it all exploded. Digital media became media, full stop. Stat counters lit up. People began to take things very seriously. We were given tools to measure our popularity and were told to prioritize SEO. Advertisement proliferated on the margins. There was competition, awards, visual-based aggregate sites like Food Gawker arrived, and the words became less important. My inexpensive point and shoot no longer would cut it. DSLRs and knowledge of the full Adobe suite was the standard, or at least the time and resources to acquire both. Output needed to match demand. Folks started making serious cash. Traditional outlets came calling, and many of us were offered columns, then books. Food blogs were leveraged into product lines, restaurants, and television programs. And then that all gave way to social media. Twitter is microblogging, Instagram a streamlined Flickr. There was an intentional sense of shared ownership in the ways these platforms presented themselves, even while the very communities we'd fostered were split into fragments cast across a boundless space. Blogs were now largely businesses, media companies on their own, peppered with affiliate links. Social media was something altogether different. Declared to immeasurably support other financial endeavors by elevating one's brand, only directly benefiting the few influencers who leveraged their effect upon others to broker deals that took place in DMs and in rooms the average user never entered. With Web 3.0, the rise of the creator is an attempt to monetize participation in an accountable transaction, controlled wholly by those within the act, upfront in the open. As Sam mentioned, through places like Patreon, Kickstarter, Cameo, Buy Me a Coffee, Substack, and myriad others. Instead of a nebulous concept of value, there are prices, tiers, and tipping models. It is an attempt to tighten the net around our various audiences, to cluster them through a link tree perhaps, even as that is simply a crossroads to those same distance corners as before. And unfortunately, for many creators, the reality falls short of the promise. Despite Bloomberg valuing the creator economy at $20 billion, that wealth is only reaped by the very few. The Twitch info leak revealed the staggering reality that only 1% of its streamers make 50% of the service's revenue. 50% make less than $28 per annum and do not even see a penny, as there is a minimum $100 payout. Similarly, a meager 5 to 10% of Substack users are reported to be paid subscribers. Before the term was coined in 2011, as claimed by Timothy Shea, consciously or not, anyone who interacted with the internet was a creator. If you commented on a forum, posted a video on YouTube, sent friends a snap, streamed an event, you have added value to a platform simply through your interaction with us. And someone profited. And those capital C creators, those who have to pay taxes, cover equipment costs, cobble together retirement plans, insurance, employ others, they function in a rebranded gig economy without any of the infrastructure of the previous models. I'm considered accomplished. I've written a book. I'm a freelance food writer for numerous pub outlets, a travel and event host, and an on-air personality. And even though I do not run ads and only very rarely engage in sponsored content on social media or in any digital space, Those channels are the consequent source of most of my income. They are my calling card, and thus my bottom line is tied to their changeability and conditions of success. There is that expectation of always hustling, always innovating, that in my agreement of terms of use was the tacit understanding of the lack of control of my own livelihood. And as Richard mentioned, the unrelenting requirement to keep pace with opaque algorithms. The economy in which we supposedly are equal participants remains largely unknowable to those of us who rely on it and to those of us who are its consumers. If we cannot define it, then it is impossible to own it, let alone to know the true gamble of being one of the few being paid. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was Tara O'Brady. Before that, Éric Grenier, Dr. Richard Lachman, and Dr. Samantha Yammine. We are excited to open up this conversation and to get into it. A shout out to our audience members. We have people registered from all over, including Nanaimo, Winnipeg, Thunder Bay, and New York. A reminder, if you have a question at any point, please submit it via Zoom chat, or if you're watching on Facebook, in the comments section. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And I'd now like to welcome back all of our talkers to the Q&A session, if you just want to turn on your cameras. And I have a few questions to get us going. I'd love to take it back to your origin stories. And it was, great to hear about your journey, especially because you've all been working the space for quite some time. Since you have to kind of be everywhere and the space is always evolving, how did you initially decide where to create content on which platforms? Tara, let's start with you, especially because it was, like so many people, started as a passion.
Well, for me, honestly, it was 2004, 2005. So there wasn't a lot of platforms that were available to me. I actually very much remember the time that my boyfriend, who is now my husband, told me about this funny little thing called blogs. And it was this strange hobby that people did, but in that way that we thought it was about making friends. It was the extension of LiveJournal or anything like that. Or as a writer, I thought it was my practice space. I didn't think people would pay attention to it. And it was very much this place that I thought that I would write and then take that creative portfolio and then be out, knocking on doors and going to publishing houses and doing it the old-fashioned way. Little did I know, by starting at 2005, I was just at that point where everything coalesced. And suddenly it didn't matter that I was writing from a small town in Southern Ontario, that I could have an audience that reached around the world. And as media outlets, of course, then, sorry for the food pun, had the appetite for—
We love puns.
For creators. And it didn't matter exactly how many publications you had written for. It didn't matter where you were coming from. It didn't matter any of that, because if you came with an audience, they were willing to hire you. So my first column was with somebody out of Calgary. My publisher is actually out of San Francisco. I never met them in person before I signed my book deal. This is what it allowed, but it was very much blogs was the way to go at that time. And it's been a fascinating thing, as I feel like in those 16 years that I've been doing this, it was that fragmentation, as we saw social media, as we saw things like Snapchat, as we saw things like these new paid programs that in places like Cameo, that now there is a choice, but it's also the fact that people who are coming into this landscape now have the aspiration, whereas we didn't know it was possible. And I think that also changes how we approach things. You can see exactly, how do I want to reach my audience? Who is my audience? And you know that these audiences live in these different spaces. And I know that everyone else on the panel today, they know who is engaged in what style of content, and you mold your content towards those spaces.
Thanks, Tara. Éric, I'd love to hear more about your early decision, especially in the world of politics, because you also started with website, weblog, which comes from the idea of like LiveJournal, log message boards, really is the original social media.
Yeah, it was an old blogger website where I first started writing. I was inspired by what was happening in the United States with the website 538.com, which was writing about, it was analyzing what was happening in the US presidential election in 2008, which was a really interesting election just to begin with. And I saw the media landscape, or at least the landscape in Canada in terms of political coverage, and there wasn't something similar. So I thought that I might want to try my hand at starting my own site that was similar, that was based on what was happening in the United States. But, you know, as I'm sure everyone on the panel understands, you know, you don't get a lot of money from Google ads, especially unless you're, you know, have millions of people going to your site every day. And I was a freelance writer before. I was used to, you know, pitching to magazines and stuff like that. But I knew that I needed to go somewhere that would actually pay me something a little bit more regularly. So it became more of a way to get into the industry in a more established way. But now that I've done it for a little while, I wanted to kind of get back that freedom that I had way back then. And so that's why I made the decision to make the switch recently. And the idea of the subscription model was something that didn't exist, at least wasn't something that I was aware of when I had my site back over a decade ago. But it gives you, at least if you're lucky enough to have a little bit of a platform to begin with, that you can at least get something that be a bit more reliable. It was very, unsteady when I first started my website just a few years out of university. But now, you know, if you have that ability, then you can have something that's a little bit more secure, though by no means it is, at least at this stage, all that lucrative.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sam, for you, how did you decide which platforms you were going to spend your time on, especially as a science communicator, you know, trying to reach as many people as possible at a time right now where people are hearing all types of things?
I started, I guess, I didn't like Tara, never went trying to be a creator, but I was really drawn to Instagram, mostly because that's where all of my friends were at the time. Again, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. That's where my friends were, and I wanted to connect with people like them who didn't really, like, science was fine to them, but they weren't seeking it out, right? And I wanted to try to show them, like, no, this could be really cool. And I liked that Instagram was very visual and aesthetic, because that would let me bring my own style and taste to things, which is something that we weren't really seeing in science. Science is always made like explosions, tough trucks and stuff like that. And that didn't vibe with me. And I wanted to be able to make content that might resonate with people like me and my friends. And that's where they were.
Great, thank you. Richard, I'd like to bring you in and learn a little bit more about the relationship between content creators and audience, because it's a very dynamic space. It's direct, you get immediate engagement. It's part of that 24/7 piece you talk about. How have you seen audiences evolve over time, both in your studies, but also from your students? I feel you're really connected to this.
Sure. So, I mean, of course, this is the sort of magic of content creation in the digital world, is that it feels like it's personal, while, as opposed to television or film or these mass media. And so the trick is, how do you still have thousands of subscribers or tens of thousands of subscribers and still maintain that personal connection style? So that feeling that it's still something that's happening in real time. So you'll hear people calling individual names for subscribers, or people setting tips on Twitch. You'll see content like Patreon, where someone will reel out the names of everyone who was a Patreon subscriber at the end of the video, or there'll be extra content that they're doing. So we're seeing this sort of specialized content people are trying to make to maintain that relationship. But with success comes the danger of success. It becomes really hard to maintain that personal nature of it. So you will sometimes see content creators move to a different style as they get much more successful. They can't be individual. They can't focus on that. But that's also the exhausting part of the role, as the content creators here on this call are talking about the 24/7 nature of this, that being able to make content that's customized to people, trying to shout out names while doing everything else that's part of trying to make a living doing this business.
Yeah, and then there's a bit of that like indie rock problem too, on your original community feeling they've been abandoned if you get too big, right? Or if you move from being online to like super mainstream. So that must be a delicate balance as well.
Right. There's an article by Kevin Kelly a number of years ago that was called 1,000 True Fans. And he was
Yeah.
looking at indie music. What if you had 1,000 people who bought everything you made, every t-shirt, every CD? Could that be enough to live on? And that metric worked in the selling CDs out of the back of your van world. But when you were getting a microtransaction, where you're getting a fraction of a penny, you need a lot more than 1,000 people. So absolutely, scale in the platform world is very different than what might have been true when you got a bigger cut of the pie.
Yeah, it's also amazing some of the lessons learned from the music industry because it's merchandise for content creators right now. And we're seeing a lot of exploration of that. Éric, I want to come back to something that you said, which is freedom. I think so many people would love to have a job at CBC, with some security and, being on television. There's a lot of excitement around that, especially in the world of politics. So what do you might mean by freedom? Like what does that look like?
Well, there's two different kinds. I mean, for one thing, I mean, a lot of people get into journalism, especially political journalism. I think you enjoy kind of the performative aspect, I think, of it. And I imagine it's also a world that attracts a lot of extroverts, which I'm not.
Yeah.
So being in that world, it was a lot of fun doing a lot of stuff on election nights, things like that. It was a lot of fun to do that. But I think that for some people, some creators who might be like me, who's more of somebody who likes, working by themselves, having that ability to just choose what you want to write about, to focus on just the things you want to write about, was really what was most appealing to me. And also just the freedom in terms of your life, being able to set your own schedule, working on a weekend if you want to, not working on a Tuesday if you want to, if you can manage it. That was something that I also felt like I needed. And what the pandemic actually showed me was that while I was working out of the newsroom in Ottawa, here in Ottawa, I didn't know that if I worked at home by myself again, if I'd like it. Maybe I would miss being at the office every day. But actually being at home for over a year and a half, I realized I like being at home. So it was easier to make the choice because I knew what it would be like to continue working on my own.
I think a lot of people have discovered if they like working at home or not, or want a hybrid of that. Thank you so much. Tara, you mentioned what's involved, right? And the infrastructure. I'd be curious your thoughts on the barrier to entry, because in many ways it's very low, where if you have one of these, you can record video, take decent photos, you can post status updates, very different than 2 decades ago, where you needed to know someone who had a video camera or a decent camera, or you needed an agent or to get headshots, etc. But at the same time, it's very hard to get followers, right? Like, I would assume there's a lot of work that goes into what you all do. So what is the true barrier to entry? What do you need if someone's watching thinking, I'd love to become a content creator? How does one really go about it?
Well, that is such a loaded question. Smartphones generally, specifically the iPhone, of course, was about putting technology in everyone's hands. It started with millions and it's billions, and you can be a photographer, you can be a videographer, you can be a writer, and you have immediate access to audiences. But what is the determiner of if those audiences actually see you? And there is the capricious nature of a viral video, but we can't bet on that. And the unfortunate thing is, if you stop and think about those who have meteoric success from my own world, if I think about someone like the Korean vegan who started on TikTok 2 years ago and has written a cookbook that came out this week and is a #3 New York Times bestseller. She was a lawyer who's now no longer a lawyer. And if you look at the production values of her videos, that's an expensive camera, that is an expensive microphone, that is time. I don't know how Joanne was able to do it with having a day job, and then the amount of time that goes into you have an editorial calendar. You have to come up with scripts, you have to come up with concepts, you have to come up with recipes, test those recipes, and then to put it out and then respond. That's the biggest part of so much of this, is the engagement. So responding to all of that. So there's also a luxury there that she has that time. She was a salaried employee and someone that was able to take that time and work. She's not worried, as some might be, with hourly wages, with things like childcare. that's one specific example, but we do have to think about the fact that we have access, while we have access to a basic technology, do we have access to lighting? Do we have access to editing software? Do we have the time and the mental capacity really to take on all these new skill sets to create this meteoric rise that we've seen with others? So there's so many ways that there are costs that creators take on, but whether or not they realize it by turning on that app.
Thanks, Tara. Richard, I'd be curious, especially because, you're in a space where students are looking to study this, right? To, see if this is something that they can work in, whether it's as a creator or maybe even, as a professional in the industry at large. So many people are self-taught, right? Come from different professions, starts as a passion project. I'd be curious, are people learning more and more about these skills in a formal sense?
Sure. So I think there's aspects of this that we can teach, right? We can teach how to do research and strategize. We can teach some of the hard skills of lighting, like 3-point lighting. We can teach that. It's a hard skill. It's pretty straightforward, but here's how to do it. Here's some products you can do. We can teach media presentation skills. We can't teach magic. And sometimes for some creators, it's that viral piece that gets on, and it might be not what you thought it was going to be. It might not be the piece of content you spent the most time on, but something strikes because trends are really hard to map. So it feels like the kind of world where you can do a lot to be prepared. And maybe you have some benefits. I like that Tara was saying, like someone who can afford that equipment right out of the box, as opposed to someone who has to save up to buy a camera. That stuff can help. But a lot of it is trying to then make a hit. So the best way I would suggest for someone getting into this is do the work, find everything you can, read about other content creators. There are, podcasting conferences like Third Coast. There's a lot of, depending on what your niche is, there's ways to learn about this. And then start making a lot of content, get good at that, and maybe don't quit your day job at the same time.
Well, Sam, I'll bring you in here because you have both going on, right? You're doing a lot of this work. And I know you're also passionate about developing the space of science communications and online creators in Canada. Do you have any advice for others, especially in your field, where it's become very cool to be a scientist or an epidemiologist as of late?
I think both what Tara and Richard said is really important, but I do also think what's nice now is that there is a trend towards low production. Like I have a really nice lav mic, and instead, because of TikTok now, I use my wired earbuds, and that's what I use as a mic, just because that's like the vibe. So I think there is a value towards like a trend towards low production. And so I would just say, like, for people who want to give things a try, don't feel you need to like map out your whole career trajectory, get all the fancy equipment, and like do all of that before you even start. The best thing to do is like take advantage of that trend, try things out, test things out, be ready to fail, be ready to like shout to the ether and no one cares. That's all part of it. That's how you find your voice. And that's how you also start to have a conversation, because you'll see what actually resonates with people. So I think like that testing out, it's very much a scientist mindset. I'm going to like try something out, see how it sticks, and go from there. But the biggest barrier is really what Tara said, of the time, because the time to actually build that conversation, because especially in science, you can't just be talking to people as a sage on the stage. People are sick of that, and that's not helpful. And that's where we failed in pandemic communications. People want to be heard and want to converse. And so figuring out how to have conversations at scale is where you get creative.
Thanks, Sam. Eric, go ahead.
Oh,
Tara.
sorry. I just wanted to really quickly interject and jump off of something that Sam said there about the trend towards lo-fi. And a great example of that is Emma Chamberlain. So, of course, a huge, enormous YouTube star who is now in fashion and coffee and so many other things. She, I think it was August of this year, after 4 years on YouTube, basically had a breakdown and said that it was, as Richard had spoke about the mental health aspect of it, said that her pace and her style of work was unsustainable for her. And so revamped everything and has absolutely gone for this lo-fi, very basic. TikTok is very much moving towards away from dancing and into this point of view, daily life, And so there is that opportunity. And that's again where this idea of being responsive to all of this comes in, but that there are these trends. And so sometimes it's also about finding where your niche is within that larger. So taking that trend and making it your own, taking that style as it evolves and finding a way to make it work for you in a sustainable way.
If I could
Also,
add,
yeah,
sorry.
go on.
If I could add something,
It
and I
points
think
to how the culture shifts as well.
I'll tell you that it's a great point of also paying attention to the platforms are not all the same. Of course, there's different character, and the platforms shift sometimes over time as well. Twitch as gaming, there's other content on Twitch now, and as you're saying, TikTok has other content. Instagram's content is changing, and the demographic of who's on Instagram is changing year by year. So paying attention to this and moving with it. But just to echo what Sam was saying, the best way, like any other media, to learn how to make it is make it. You want to learn how to write stuff. You want to learn how to make music, make music.
Great, thank you. Now, online content creation is really changing everything. It's changing our perception of what media is, what celebrity is, what work is, what income can be, brand partnerships. This question for all of you, what resources would you like to see for this emerging field as it continues to grow and really have an impact on our economy?
I can start. I think for me in the educational space, what's really interesting is there's tons of government and grant support for people doing science outreach and other forms of education too outside of the sciences if they're affiliated with an institution. There's so much funding in that. Over the pandemic, there's been tons of funding in that. There's not a lot of support for people like me doing things independently. And I would like to see us starting to recognize that the independent people can really make a difference, and we need to expand those funding opportunities, because that's how a lot of other artists and media get off the ground. And I think that's like a really clear, relatively easy thing we can do.
I might echo Sam that it's a great point. You're talking about in education. It's true in media creation across all of this. A lot of our systems. So just because this is pixels moving on a screen does not mean it's the same as television. Just because it's audio does not mean it's the same as radio. It's not the same creators. The path towards the Canadian voice, which I know is some of what we want to talk about here, the path towards which voices are heard, the path towards getting an audience is not identical. And so thinking about regulation, thinking about funding, thinking about discoverability, which is a thing we talk about a lot of times with very little understanding, it feels like, on the part of government in terms of how this actually happens, is very challenging. And the fourth part of this is we are Canadians working in a world market. Yes, we are reaching out to other Canadians, but you make something on YouTube, it goes anywhere, it can. And so there's things that we can leverage from that. In terms of understanding maybe who gets support, not just for telling Canadian stories in Canada, but if you can tell a diaspora narrative, if you are part of a community that can reach populations anywhere around the world, yet you're Canadian, maybe that's a Canadian story too. So I feel like we need to maybe shift who's regulating, who's active in these spaces from a government point of view, and also who gets access to funding and growth.
Well, and Eric, I'd like to bring up that point you mentioned in your talk, which is creating Canadian content. There's English, there's French, the limitations and opportunities that. So what are your thoughts, especially someone who really covers exclusively Canadian politics?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges is that, there's not going to be a lot of interest in a New Brunswick election outside of Canada, let alone in New
How
Brunswick.
dare they?
But that's, I think, one of the challenges is that, yes, we want to create content that, will be very popular around the world, because that's great, right? People around the world learning about Canada, learning about Canadians is a good thing. But we also need to be able to create stuff that will be useful to Canadians itself, right? Especially if we're talking about support for creators themselves. So I think that is one of the challenges. And I don't actually know what the answer is, how much of this is translatable to specifically Canadian content targeted at Canadians. And I do wonder if we do have a big enough market to sustain a lot of it. And when I was talking earlier about, local journalism, that is the kind of thing that, it could be the kind of solution where you have in some areas where you can get enough subscribers to a local journalism product that is not like a standard newspaper, but can it work? If you're not a mid-sized city, can you get enough people to do it on your own? I don't know what the answer is to that.
Tara, what supports would you like to see?
It's a very difficult thing because, of course, in the food media space, it's something that I know in journalism that I'm sure that Éric has dealt with as well, is that, and Sam mentioned, is the idea of value. Truthfully, traditionally, food media is also up against the challenge that it is run largely by women. And because of that, there is this feeling of it as unskilled work. So I frequently get people that when I write for the Globe and Mail and my story is behind the paywall, I will get angry letters sent to me, not sent to the newspaper, asking if I can email them the story, even though it is that paywall that is actually paying me. And I'm not on staff, so I don't have those benefits, that I don't have that security. And the same thing goes again with this idea of, if you are working in a service space as an educator, as Sam is, or as a journalist, as Éric is, anytime you start looking at sponsored content, it can feel really icky really quickly, because then it can dilute the messaging of the rest of your work to your audience. They have, exactly as you said, that feeling of betrayal, that they were your ride or dies, and here you are suddenly trying to sell them something. So what is truly lacking is this idea of, as much as we love our Canadian creators, those who are creating culture, those who are creating content, those who are creating value across all of these platforms, where is the structure in any sort of industry way to actually support them, to make this viable for them beyond the spirit of their entrepreneurship?
Thank you so much. This has been such a thoughtful conversation, and I think we're really just touching the beginning of something much larger. So thank you all for sharing your insights and your experience with us. Thanks again. We have heard from Éric Grenier, Dr. Richard Lachman, Tara O'Brady, and Dr. Samantha Yammine. And you can find all of them, of course, online. And I encourage you to support the content creators you enjoy, including the ones that we've just heard from. If you have enjoyed today's event, we have more coming up. This Thursday, Media Smarts presents the Walrus Talks at Home, our digital lives. So if you like this one, definitely tune into that. Then on Tuesday, November 16th, we have the Walrus Talks at Home Ingenuity. This is supported by the Rossi Foundation. And on November 23rd, Brain Canada presents the Walrus Talks at Home Youth Mental Health, a very timely topic. Check in with us at thewalrus.ca/events. You can browse our schedule. You can RSVP for events that you're interested in. And we'll be posting the videos from tonight and all of our videos in the Walrus Talks video room at our website. Also, keep an eye on your inbox. We're going to follow up with an email, and the best way to stay in touch with us and to not miss a single thing is to opt into our newsletter. At the Walrus, we really believe that trustworthy journalism is an essential service. And with your support, we can continue to do what we do best: fact-checked, thought-provoking journalism that Canadians can rely on. We have just launched our fall campaign, and this is the time of year when we reach out to our community for support. So if you enjoyed this free event, consider making a donation at thewalrus.ca/donate. If you make a donation of $20 or more, we're a registered charity, so you will receive a tax receipt. Thank you to Erin, Rachel, Kevin, and Mark at Facebook Canada for making this conversation possible tonight and our partnership together on the future of the internet. Thank you to our other annual sponsors, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Air Canada, and Shaw. Community is really important in these COVID times, and all of you tuning in tonight are part of the Walrus. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. We'll be in touch.